As always, the content is on point and very relevant. We are in these organizations and we are expected to perform and walk in water, but the culture and the leadership has got such glaring issues. So I think this is a nice space just to indulge on how it can be done better so that we're not sitting and moaning and complaining, but really more focused on how we can also influence as part of the leadership and influence the culture and the leadership. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Then a separate comment. So I think, yeah, well done for taking this platform, for speaking out. And I think from a brand perspective, we can see the brand values, we can see the brand purpose, we can see the legacy. So thank you. I mean, Africa is blessed. In fact, the globe is blessed just to have people like you, because this is just one aspect that is giving selflessly and it's empowering. So thank you. And for me personally, it's inspiring. It makes me just build confidence to speak out. So thank you for igniting.
Friends and family from South Africa and the rest of the globe, hey tada! Welcome to yet another exciting episode of the Simply Label podcast. I'm your host, Simply Label. How cool were those two voice notes to kick off this week's podcast, though? Wow, wow. Feedback is such a great gift. It sharpens and encourages a dreamer like myself and many of you listening to keep dreaming and keep working. These two voice notes came from one of the biggest supporters and members of the Simply Label podcast family in South Africa in response to our last episode that we did called Great Leadership plus Great Culture equals Great Performance. I want to say thank you to my sister for those powerful yet humbling words of encouragement. Well, friends, you can also do the same on Spotify or via a voice note link, which we will share across all our social media presence. Friends, do we have a show for you today? Let's kick it off with this clip that I got from YouTube as I was preparing for this show. We'll be back right after this.
Strategy is not what it was. Old strategies die in endless boardroom meetings. New strategies thrive in dynamic cultures with a shared vision. Old strategy listens to the strategy hits from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. New strategy listens to those closest to the customer, ready to adapt when needed. Old strategy gets shown on a fancy presentation, maybe once. The new strategy is constantly shared, engaged, and evolved by all. Old strategy is top down because it always was. New strategy can move in any direction, empowering those that drive it. Old strategy is all about content and having a story that just makes sense. New strategy is focused on context and true alignment between teams, goals, and everyday action. Old strategy is obsessed with measuring output, no matter the cost. New strategy understands that outcomes matter, sometimes even more than just metrics. Old strategy is just for a select few, playing a private little game. New strategy understands that we're all in the game, and that the game has changed. Strategy is not what it was, so make it count. Strategy.
Wow, awesome. Apologies for that slight glitch. Friends, how cool was that clip, though? I think it was challenging as it was eye opening. Don't you think? Well, I chose this specific clip because I believe it sets the tone for the discussion we're about to have today. We've chosen to title this episode, friends, Thinkers and Doers. Yes, thinkers and doers. So, how did this come about? 4 weeks ago, As I was going on one of my regular walks, I started reflecting on my professional experience, having worked for three of the major, of the five major financial services organizations in South Africa. It suddenly dawned on me in that moment that while their cultures and organizational constructs differ one from another, yet the way in which strategy is developed, communicated, and executed upon is very similar across all three of these incredible organizations. This is largely driven by the organizational makeup or design. Here's an example. Typically, in a summarized manner, you have the following, right? You have the top level management or leadership, as some would prefer to call them, which invariably would consist of a CEO and his or her, executive committee, or those leaders who are executives in their respective businesses. I would like to call these, for the purposes of today's episode, the thinkers. Secondly, depending on the size and the makeup of the organization, you would then have senior management, which typically would consist of heads of business units and or product heads, or a combination of both. It depends on your organizational construct. These are then followed by the what we call middle management, which often would comprise of managers of managers or managers of others, if that makes sense, right? So managers of managers would potentially be in many organizations be like your area managers, as an example, who have a number of smaller little branches. If this is a scaled out business that runs almost like a franchise model. So the area or regional manager would then have a number of managers who then report to them. And these managers then in turn would be the ones that are managing or leading the frontline teams, the customer facing teams, and which is that next layer then, the frontline teams, typically customer facing. For the purposes of today's episode, I'd like to call them the doers. So what you then have right at the top are the thinkers, which often comprise of, in terms of the size of the organization, often if an organization is big, that's the top, anything between 8 to 10% of the organization by population. And the doers, which often would be 80% often, or perhaps in some instances, depending on the organizational makeup, might be anything between 65 to 80% of the population of the organization. So what you then have typically is that 10% of the organization does all the thinking, and the majority part of the organization, the doers, does all the doing. And I know I'm oversimplifying this, but I think it will make sense as we continue with the rest of this engagement. As a disclaimer, folks, I must say at this point that this episode is not an exercise intended to criticize or to speak against or even for this type of organizational constructs. Not at all. I believe it has its place. In my humble opinion, there must be accountability in an organization, large or small. And naturally, the higher up the ladder in an organizational, construct or makeup, the higher the responsibility and accountability. What I do want to explore, however, is the gap that so often seems to exist in the context of how strategy is formulated, communicated, and implemented or executed upon, especially within a large organization. How it seems to work in most large organizations is that strategy formulation happens right at the top, strictly as a role of top management, quote unquote, the thinkers. And then this strategy is then communicated largely, at the purview of senior or a combination of senior and middle management, which I would like for today to call the incubators. And then lastly, strategy implementation or execution is left often strictly to the frontline teams, which we've agreed already to call the doers. So why am I, sharing all of this with you. I think I wanted to lay the foundation, friends, so that we understand and we stay together and in sync for the rest of this conversation. So, historically, and perhaps unintentionally, this way of working seems to have resulted in an unavoidable and perhaps unintentional gap between the very top of the organization and the very bottom ranked of the organization. In other words, or in short, there exists a huge divide or a gap between the thinkers and the doers, particularly in large organizations. To further illustrate this point, I was blown away recently when a very good friend of mine wrote to me and asked me the following question on my LinkedIn page. He said the following: most big organizations have well written, carefully researched visions, slogans, and agenda. These are then communicated via roadshows, TV interviews, internal broadcasts, etc. Yet there seems to be a big disconnect between what is communicated by top leadership and the actual experience on the ground. What needs to happen to ensure that what is communicated top of house is actually felt by people, or the people doing the actual work on the ground? And I close quote. As you can imagine, friends, I was so excited by this question because, as crazy as what I'm about to share with you is going to sound, I had been contemplating this particular episode for some time. I mean, I had even the title already decided upon and all, so it was such an inspired, apt question to ask. So I humbly asked my friend to hold on a little while as we would deal with this particular question in the podcast. So here we are. I bet many of you listening today who currently work for or have worked in a big corporate can probably relate to this question, right? I also would like to assert that this question is so important, and perhaps this is a disclaimer of sorts. This question is so important and multi-layered that we may not be able to exhaust it in one go. I want to keep our podcast within just half an hour at the very longest, because time is so precious in the time that we live in. So what I will do for the purposes of today, I will extract some few points from this very important question as follows. Number one, strategy. We assume that this strategy that is being referred to by my friend, and of course that I'm extrapolating as well in this episode, that strategy is a function of the organization's vision and mission, right? But what then often happens is it gets developed right at the top of the organization, and there's nothing wrong with that. Often people would say, the higher you go, the more you get paid to think. I get that. So what then happens is, number two, a huge, most of these big organizations have a huge budget, or you spend lots of money on communication of the strategy once it's been developed right at the top by the thinkers, right? Remember, the thinkers. So it gets a lot of money gets spent on booking hotels, venues, or traveling, going on a road show, whatever the case may be. And unintentionally, what happens is people get a lot of information, right? And nothing wrong with information, but often the unintended consequence is that when colleagues come into such an environment, I must say, on a light-hearted note, that's some people, it's a joy, it's a lekker event to be out and out of the office, and and mingle and jingle and you know but that's the unintended consequence. But that's not also necessarily a bad thing, because what you want to create in any organization is a great vibe, a great environment where people can actually be people, and so we are social beings by nature. But if we bring it back to today's context, um, a lot of information then gets shared as at these conferences and information sessions. However, where the missing link comes is that people still leave with a lot of information, but not necessarily the buy-in. A lot of information that they had no part in crafting. It may be a great strategy that is being shared, absolutely, on paper, usually via PowerPoint or whatever the case may be. It may be great on paper and in theory, but often the missed opportunity is that the colleagues that it's being shared with had no part in informing what that strategy looked like. And we're going to talk a lot more about that as we continue with today's episode. The third thing I want to pull out of this question is, and this is what I began asking myself when my friend asked this question, how then are we as these big organizations testing for understanding, number one, and how do we also test for buy-in? It's an open-ended question, and I would like to leave it here because I think it deserves an episode on its own. I'm not suggesting we will do one, but I think it's a much bigger discussion that really needs to be explored. I want to take the discussion in this direction, however. How do we then close this inevitable gap between the thinkers and the doers? How do we solve for that gap? I want to propose 3 ways. By no means are these the only things that I believe organizations can do. It is not an exhaustive list. I don't want to give you a whole grocery list of things to walk away with. But I do believe, as it's the case in any problem solving situation, that often there is that 20% of the most important activities that you can focus and zoom in on uncompromisingly, so that will give you 80% of the outcome or the output that you're looking for. And in my humble opinion, I want to propose 3 of them. Number 1, invite the doers to the thinking table. Invite the doers to the thinking table. What comes to my mind right now is the Apple organization, the Apple model. One time they asked Steve Jobs, from a leadership perspective, what makes Apple so successful? And his response was very peculiar to me. He said, well, quite frankly, everybody does everything. I sit hand in hand with a technician, an engineer, and this one who does that role and the other role. And of course, I'm paraphrasing it. And we decide, and everyone has a voice, and everyone contributes, because the end game is to solve for the need of the customer. So it doesn't matter who the idea comes from, it gets considered. And I thought that was so profound. Another thing that he said in a separate interview, they asked him, just for the life of me, I forgot what the question was. And they asked Steve Jobs. His response was, well, we hire smart people to come and tell us what to do. Often the mistake that many organizations make is we hire them and they are smart and we come and tell them what to do. Flip that on its head. Right? So invite the doers to the thinking table. So for your organization, if you're listening, that construct, of course, might differ, right? Or the context rather might differ as to how you put this into place. If you remember in our previous episode when we dealt with the multiplier leader, we talked about the phenomena of how a multiplier leads is that they give people permission to think, in inverted commas, right? Give room and value to the voice of the people closest to the customer. If you heard that clip earlier, which we kicked off with, strategy has moved from just a PowerPoint presentation that is shared and a whole lot of content to what is called now context and alignment. And it can come from any level of the organization, but it won't if you do not invite the doers to the thinking table. Just because they are frontline and they are in a customer-facing role or a junior role, as it were, does not mean they cannot think. Invite the thinkers to the doing, or rather the doers to the thinking table. I'm also thinking of an example where if you are leading a sales team, if you're a sales manager or a person that runs sales teams, it's often a very data-driven environment. right? And often I've seen, and I've done it myself, I must be honest, where we get sales data and it's presented, and often the mistake I myself even have made is to go on and tell the people what is already on the stats that they have seen. How about we flip that on its head and ask our people what they think about the data before them? What is the data telling them? And based on that, we'll get a lot of rich information. We'll get how they interpret the data for themselves, and therefore what the insights are that can help enrich what the way forward is for an organization. It will result in, inevitably, in higher engagement levels and richer data from the people that are closest to the customer. Let's move to number two. Number two, leverage the power of co-creation. Co-creation is a fairly new concept in the context of modern day era of leadership, organizational leadership and culture, for that matter. It really actually calls for exactly that: a transformation in a culture of an organization wherein, if done well, because this builds from number one, right? Invite the doers to the thinking table. But if done well, and it can happen in various ways, right? Whether you issue out surveys where you seek an input from colleagues before you even share a final strategy. Why? Because what you're looking for is for your frontline, or your doers, as it were, to appreciate the fact that their views are being taken into consideration, and they are part of the creation of the strategy and the direction of the organization. It therefore inevitably will result in a culture or a greater culture of innovation. And of course, it will result in alignment between vision, strategy, and execution. Number three, encourage a culture of problem solving at all levels of the organization. The other day, I was having a conversation with one of my very good friends, who is in the people business, an HR, senior HR business partner in a respectable financial institution, and she was telling me that in our organization, we we solve for the customer, and we allow our people to break the rules in solving for customers. And I thought, whew, that sounds a bit radical. She says, well, it kind of is from a culture perspective. It's still done within the confines of compliance, because of course the finance industry is a highly regulated industry in South Africa. But however, what it does do then, it helps remove, or at least eliminate, the red tapes which often delay us delivering to a customer. So we allow them to break the rules, and we let them apologize later. I thought that's radical, but it's awesome. Can you imagine what that would look like for your organization if we empower our frontline to solve for customers' problems on the spot? Because customers have got a choice now. Customer is king, as it were. They've got a choice, and they will choose where they're being supported or assisted, where their problem is resolved the quickest and the cheapest, or maybe not the cheapest, but in the way that is value for money from the customer's perspective. What this will also do then is it will result in a multiplication of intelligence and accountability across all levels of the organization. Those are the three things I wanted to share with you, folks. In closing, I'd like to assert that if every organization, large and small, makes a concerted effort to apply these principles or similar ones, not only can the gap be closed between thinkers and doers, but more importantly, there may soon not be a difference between thinkers and doers, if you know what I mean, because the doers will grow to become thinkers, and the organization will benefit as a result of this particular shift. It's a radical shift in how an organization can run, and how a culture can be transformed, and that's leading to building highly innovative, customer-centric, employee-friendly, and profitable organizations. Well, friends, allow me to leave it here for this week. Once again, thank you for your continued listenership and support. Please follow us on Spotify and click the notification icon so you get notified when an episode has been published. May this be a great rest of the week for you. May you find fulfillment and contentment. God bless you. This is Simply Label from the Simply Label podcast. Tada!
Strategy is not what it was. Old strategies die in endless boardroom meetings. New strategies thrive in dynamic cultures with a shared vision. Old strategy listens to the strategy hits from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. New strategy listens to those closest to the customer, ready to adapt when needed. Old strategy gets shown on a fancy presentation, maybe once. The new strategy is constantly shared, engaged, and evolved by all. Old strategy is top-down because it always was. New strategy can move in any direction, empowering those that drive it. Old strategy is all about content and having a story that just makes sense. New strategy is focused on context and true alignment between teams, goals, and everyday action. Old strategy is obsessed with measuring output, no matter the cost. New strategy understands that outcomes matter, sometimes even more than just metrics. Old strategy is just for a select few, playing a private little game. New strategy understands that we're all in the game, and that the game has changed. Strategy is not what it was, so make it count.